Morning, everyone. How you all going? Glad to be here? Isn't it great to be here? I've been looking forward to today. I know I've been looking forward to sharing with you today as well. But just a couple of things before we rip into it. The nominating committee report will be out. Will be hot off the press, and we'll give it to you following the service. So it's good news. It's out early, isn't it? And so I appreciate very much those who've been able to take up church office for next year, and it's very much appreciated. And no doubt there'll be others who will assist that are not necessarily on the list of church officers, and so there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, and so that work is just as important and is very much appreciated. Now, just one other thing, we will start up small groups. Again, remember a few years back we used to have our meeting on a Monday night, and we wish to start that up again. So we'll start on the Monday after Queen's birthday, and we'll be looking at the book of Acts. And so it's always amazed me, when Jesus was on the cross, the church looked in such disarray at that moment. With all the disciples fleeing, and the church looked as though, and Jesus' legacy looked as though it was going to pass when Jesus gave up his life at that point in time. And yet, when Acts chapter 1 and the Christian church was birthed, we today live in that legacy of what they did in Acts. Isn't that incredible? Their witness and the lives that they literally gave up, we live in their legacy today. So we want to look at and how the Holy Spirit worked through the church, because as the Holy Spirit was poured out then, so it will be just before Jesus comes again. And I have mentioned up here that as the Spirit will be poured out, there will be half the church that will miss out on it. Do you realise that? Now, that's a frightening thought, isn't it? It should be a frightening thought, because we are told, and she said, I've been shown over and over again that this parable of the wise and the foolish virgins will be fulfilled literally. And so we can learn a lot from Acts, and so we will be sort of looking at that anyway. So we'll probably put that in the bulletin. All right, we better get started because we've got a fair bit to get through today. But just to let you know where we are going with, so that there are no surprises and you're wondering where on earth Mark is going. So we're going to be looking at contracts, covenants, treaties, and how that was done in the Old Testament. Because how it was done in the Old Testament is directly relevant to what we're going to be celebrating today. And the way that God made covenants, it's fascinating. And so we're just going to peel away at a few of those layers today. Now, when we do contracts today, like employment contracts, when I was about 10 or 12 years into ministry before I even got my first contract. And they called me into the office and they wanted me to sign it. I thought, sign a contract? I've been working for you for 12 years. And so they just got this wee 2-page contract. I didn't even bother reading it, just signed it. I thought, what's the point? Different world today. The Australian Union Conference made up new employment contracts for the ministers, and their first draft was 20 pages long. how much do you need to say? Just do your work. Do what you call. I don't get it, but I'm very much old school, and a wink and a nudge and a shake of a hand, and your yes be yes and your no be no, and you be faithful to what you are called to do. And in terms of if you got a job for someone, that your yes will be yes. But how much worth are these contracts today? Are they worth a lot? Mate, you end up fighting them out in court and fair work and all that sort of thing, and it's just a pain in the neck. It really is. Contracts really aren't worth a lot that they are written on. Treaties. Google treaties and Google the fact that how treaties were broken don't mean a thing of what they're written on. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, all the countries sign it and nobody observes it. Well, what's the point? But let's have a weird look at a treaty that was signed back in 1938. All right. Now, this sermon is entitled, Was Jesus Really Serious About Saving Humanity? Was Jesus really serious about saving us? And I'll tell you what, when you see how God ratifies covenants, hopefully we'll understand more clearly that Jesus is indeed serious about saving humanity. Anyway, let's have a look at the Munich Pact, or sometimes dubbed as the Munich Betrayal. And this deal was cut back in 1938. This was the map of Europe in 1938, and the Munich Pact was all about this tiny little wee country there that butts into Germany called Czechoslovakia. We would know that today it's the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So Czechoslovakia became very much the centre of the Munich Pact that was signed. And so there was Czechoslovakia, and what the Germans were wanting at the time was to overtake a part of Czechoslovakia that was called the Sudetenland. And the Sudetenland, there were 20% Germans there, and all during the 1930s, Hitler had been sowing dissent within the Sudetenland to try and sort of create the idea of, well, the part of the objective of the Third Reich was to have all the Germans together. And so there was a real reluctance to enter into another war. And Europe, and I can't blame them for this, Europe did not want another war. World War I was still fresh in their mind. And even, Winston Churchill had gone through World War I. By the way, he was very much opposed to this Munich Pact, by the way, despite going through World War I. But nonetheless, though, all the people did not want to go through another war. So, this was diplomacy by salami tactics. All right, slice by slice, and you'll see what I mean. All right, so you got Bohemia, Czechoslovakia there, and Hitler was wanting to get his hands on the Sudetenland, and so he called a conference at this hotel here in Bonn in Germany, and that was his favourite hotel, and his favourite room was room 106, which was specially fitted out just for Adolf Hitler. And so he got over there, Bertino Mussolini, as well as the French Prime Minister and Neville Chamberlain. And they all came over there. And in the room next door was the Czechoslovakian ambassador, who was not allowed to see Hitler at all. And so what Hitler wanted, you give us Sudetenland, that little part of Czechoslovakia, and we will be happy. Fair enough, isn't it? Absolutely. So, they all agreed. Neville Chamberlain, shaking hands with Adolf Hitler, agreed with it. And the French Prime Minister signed the pact. And of course, Hitler agreed to it as well. Woohoo! And they all stand up there, all for their photo opportunity there for everyone to say, yep, we've signed the Munich Pact. And poor old Czechoslovakia, well, they essentially got sold out in the whole process. And Edouard de Ladera, the French Prime Minister, goes back to France, and he also, the people there greeted him at the airport, and they all cheered. They cheered because they are saving Europe from another world war. And you know what de Ladera said? If they only knew. He essentially said that Hitler will not stop at the Sudetenland, he will not stop at Czechoslovakia, Poland or Hungary. He wants the whole lot. That's what he said on that day when everybody cheered, if they only knew. Neville Chamberlain famously waved up the pact that had been signed, and all the English also celebrated, we've saved the world from another world war. And of course, we know what happened next. Less than 12 months later, he had already invaded Czechoslovakia. Poland wanted their slice of Czechoslovakia as well, and there's the other slice of the salami. Hungary wanted their slice because they wanted to recover their own territory, but then Germany says, well, no, we want the whole lot. And then Poland, who had sort of also betrayed Czechoslovakia by invading what they saw as their portion, then Germany invaded Poland, and the war started. And they couldn't stop the war. What value was that treaty? Wasn't even worth the paper that it was written on. Terrible, isn't it? Absolutely shocking. You know, and Neville Chamberlain was reviled amongst, you know, and history has been very unkind to Neville Chamberlain, you know, because the appeasement doctrine of appeasing dictators was used by MacArthur in the Korean War and ever since. But as they sort of look back, well, they sort of were a little bit more kinder to Neville Chamberlain. Well, he was trying to avoid war. He did go back to it because England was not ready. You know, when man signs treaties, is it worth the paper it's written on? Contracts, sale, courts are tied up. Australia is the most litigious society in the world, Australia, because they all fight out these contracts in the courts. Not worth anything. Treaties are not worth anything. But what about God's treaty? What about God's covenant? And I want to give you an insight into Genesis chapter 15 that will give us a unique insight into how serious God takes the covenant. Now, some of it is a little bit gory, so you might say around about R16 or for mature audience only. So there's a little wee bit of a warning. You may need a little bit of earmuffs there at certain little points. But let's have a look at Genesis chapter 15 and we'll have a look there. So, Genesis chapter 15. And we'll read from verse 1. All right, so, and He says here, after these things, in Genesis chapter 15, we'll read verse 1. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not fear, Abram. I am a shield to you. Your reward will be very great." Abram said, "O Lord God, what will you give me, since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus?" And Abram said, "Since you have given no offspring to me, one born in my household is my heir." So here Abraham is questioning the covenant up to this point. You remember that God had already said to him that I promise you that I will make you a great nation. And God is saying, do not fear. But now Abraham is questioning, but you haven't given it to me. What's going on here? And so the conversation continues, and Abram said, "Since you have given no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir." Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "This man will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir." Okay, well, that's good news, but there's a problem. Verse 5, "And he took him outside and he said, 'Now look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them.' And he said to him, 'So shall your descendants be.' Then he believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness." Okay, now don't want you to miss this verse here. So he got him to look outside. What did he see? Saw the stars. What were these stars representative of? His descendants, his offspring. And what was Abraham's response at this point? He believed, and it was counted as... Does that verse sound familiar? Romans chapter 4, verse 3. Now, when Paul was talking about salvation, Paul takes people back to Genesis, back to Abraham. And so, which is interesting of itself. And so at this point, Abraham believed, and it was counted as... Good news, isn't it? Terrific. And it gets even better. Look. Okay, so verse 7. "And he said to him, I am the Lord that brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it. And he said, O Lord God, how may I know that I will possess it?" Well, now he's questioning it, isn't he? Didn't he believe? Now he's questioning. How may I know that I'll possess it? And so he said to him, "Bring me a 3-year-old heifer." So here you have a situation where God has promised him this. He has said this. He believed, and it was counted to him as righteousness. But now he's questioning God again. I thought he believed. That in part is good news in the sense that God will accept us where we are, and even though we may have questions about that, he's willing to work with us through those questions. And he works through with Abraham and answers him the question, how will I know that you will fulfill this for me? How will I know? So now, this is the R-rated part, so some animals were killed in this part of the story. All right, okay. All right, so, all right, so let's just go back to verse 6. "Then he believed in the Lord, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of the land of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you to possess it." And he said, "Lord, how may I know that I will possess it?" So there's the question. Now this is the process in which he starts to ratify the covenant. Now, this can get a little bit technical, but it's the technicalities that gives us the wow factor in this. So, let's just peel away at it progressively. And he says, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Then he brought all these to him, and he cut them in two, and laid each half opposite each other, but he did not cut the birds. And the birds of the prey came down upon the carcasses of Abraham, and he drove them away. All right, so he's got these animals, he kills them, and he cuts them in half, and they're laid on either side there. And so you've got the heifer, you've got the goat and the ram, and then you have a few other animals as well, including the turtle doves and all that sort of thing along there. All right, so verse 12, what happens next? Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abraham, and behold, a terror and a great darkness fell upon him. And God said to Abraham, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterwards will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you'll be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites, for it is not yet complete. Now it's verse 17, we see now this is going back to the covenant. And it came about when the sun had set, and it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch, which passed between these pieces on that day that the Lord made a covenant with Abraham. To your descendants I have given this land. Okay, all right. How does all this work? What were those animals again? A heifer? What happened to that heifer? He was whoosh, plonked like that. What else? A heifer?
3-year-old female goat.
Goat? Whoosh, and a ram? What happened to the ram? It was cut in two, put on side. And there was other animals, birds and that sort of thing that were also. And what would happen is that when a treaty was completed during that time, in the cultural world back then, there were treaties between countries, all right? So you get the parties like Hitler and Mussolini and Guilladera and Chamberlain and all that, they'll get them there. But back in the Old Testament, they will be between a larger country and a smaller one. And that was called a suzerain vassal treaty. The suzerain was the larger country, all right? So you would have China, Taiwan in today's terms, okay? Suzerain, vassal. Vassal was your smaller one, and your smaller one would be the one who would have to sign the covenant kowtowing to the larger one. And so they would then have to walk through those pieces, and they're called pieces is the heifer, the goat and the ram and the birds and all that sort of. They would have to walk through those pieces. What do those pieces mean to the one who was signing the treaty to the larger country or the empire, to the suzerain? What did it mean for a vassal country to walk through those pieces? This is the part that is really fascinating. And there was a treaty that was signed between two nations of Assyria and the king of Arphad. And it was signed on this tablet here. And when they discovered this tablet, they then interpreted it. Let me help you with some interpretation of this one. All right. So, this was between the two parties of the vassal was King Matiilu and Asa-Neriri V, who was the king of Assyria. He was the king of Assyria for about 10 years in the 750 BC. This treaty was signed in 754 BC between Matiilu and Asa-Neriri V. Now, I want you to notice some of the wording. So, Matiilu was the vassal. So Matiilu is the one who has to kowtow to the larger king of Assyria. Arphad was in the northwest of Syria, up where Aleppo is today. So may Matiilu, his sons and daughters, and his magnates and the people that become all together like, may his land, I love hyperbole, and wasteland may only be the area the size of a brick. So in other words, his land that he will have and inherit will be the size of a brick. How big is a brick? Not real big. I love hyperbole. And you notice that he and his family will be crushed like gypsum. Okay? So he's going to be crushed. Now, this head, right. So what were these animals again? We've got a ram, a heifer, and a goat, and the pieces. So there's the head, all right? So I want you to visualise that. This head is not the head of a spring lamb. It is the head of Matiilu. And it is the head of his sons, his magnates, and the people of his land. And if Matiilu should sin against this treaty, so may as the head of this spring lamb is what? Cut off. And its knuckle placed in its mouth, and the head of Matiilu be cut off. Now, what this means is this treaty would have been done in the same way as Genesis chapter 15. All right? So now you have a treaty between God and Abraham. This one here was between Matiilu and Asa-Neriri V. And Asa-Neriri was standing there as King. Matiilu and his sons and his families were there, and they got the heifer, the ram and the goat and the birds and all that sort of thing. And I want you to walk through those pieces. As they walk through those pieces, this treaty would say, if you break this treaty, you see that head of the lamb? That head of the lamb is your head. And when that head of the lamb, if you break this treaty, your head will come off. And all your family will be killed. So that was an incentive to obey the treaty. You get the idea? You're with me so far? That's how covenants were done. Pretty brutal, isn't it? Now, God uses the same sort of language and culture back then to sign a treaty with Abraham. How will I know that I will inherit what? The land. How will I know that there'll be all these descendants? Here's the very interesting thing. Let's go back to, I think it's verse 12, I think. Verse 12. No, we won't. Verse 17. Verse 17. And it came about when the sun had set that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham. To your descendants I have given you this land. Now, for Abraham, when he would have heard that, he would have been stunned. He would have been absolutely stunned, because he knew about Jeremiah chapter 34. Let's just go through to Jeremiah 34. And we'll just quickly just pick up this passage here because it emphasises the same point. Jeremiah 34, verse 18. And it's talking about the signing of the covenants again. It says here, for I will give the men who have transgressed my covenant, who have not fulfilled the words of the covenant which they have made before me, when they cut the calf in two, passed between its parts, or its pieces, the officials of Judah and the officials of Jerusalem, the court officers and the priests and all the people of the land who pass between the parts of the calf, I will give them into the hand of their enemies and into the hand of those who seek their life. So you know how much is on there. Now, so how much is on the line? Because there was the suzerain, the vassal treaty. If they disobeyed the treaty, their family and themselves will be killed or cut off. But we read in verse 17, it came about when the sun had set, it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch. Smoking oven and a flaming torch? What on earth does that mean? Well, glad you asked that question. I know it was just burning on you. All right, let's just come over to Exodus chapter 19, verse 18, and we'll just quickly pick up this one here. Exodus chapter 19 and verse 18. And it says here, now Mount Sinai was all in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace. Oh, the smoke of a furnace. Smoke of an oven. And the whole mountain quaked violently. And 20 verse 18 just says, and the people perceived the thunder and the lightning and the flashes and the sound of the trumpet. And this was the presence of God again. And the mountain smoking, when the people saw it, they trembled and stood at a distance. And the smoke and the lighting is the same word as a torch here. Now, let's put the pieces together. Let's put some pieces together. So, go back to verse 17, chapter 15. And it came about when the sun had set, it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven. Who was that? That was God, based on Exodus chapter 19, verse 18. And a flaming torch, 20 verse 18, same word, passed between those pieces. Now, what did I say before about a suzerain vassal treaty? It was the vassal, the smaller country, that would walk between the pieces. And what would happen if that treaty was broken? Off with their head. Who walks between the pieces here? God. It's God who walks between those pieces here. Isn't that odd? It should be the other way around. That has never ever happened in any of the traditions in the ancient Near East treaties, where the bigger party, the suzerain, the more powerful, or for that matter, any of the other gods and then the other nations will walk through the pieces. What is God saying to Abraham? This covenant here that we are agreeing to or signing to with the ram, the heifer and the goat that were cut in pieces. I am sealing that covenant with my blood. And if this covenant is broken, I would rather that God be ripped from God than break this covenant. This word cut is a word that is used throughout the Old Testament, where God cuts a covenant, which brings us back to Genesis chapter 15, which is one of the most striking accounts of the gospel here, of what God is willing to do to sacrifice his life that we might live. Isaiah chapter 53 verse 8 uses the word cut, which is the messianic chapter, which brings us back to Genesis chapter 15, that God himself would rather walk through the pieces. Daniel chapter 9, 26, 27, where the Messiah shall be cut off. Same word. Same word. And you know what this word cut off means? It means literally a death. that you shall be cut off. But not just for this life, but for the life to come. If you break this covenant, this is going to be the second death for the suzerain and vassal treaties. The vassal, this will be the second death for you. You'll be cut off and cut off from life after that. And so when God himself walks through those pieces, he is saying that I would rather us be separated than to break this treaty. And Jesus himself, when he was here on earth, could not see past the cross. Do you know what Jesus said on the cross? Why, God, have you forsaken me? He could not see through the portals of the tomb. And it is in that way, in the cut off analogy, that Jesus himself experienced the second death because he could not see through the portals of the tomb. Jesus himself walked through those pieces. He walked through those pieces that we might live. Is that incredible? What a marvelous God we worship. That he would do that. That he is willing to cut himself off that we might live. And that covenant is assured on Jesus' blood as God himself, walked through those pieces. And so when we celebrate communion, these pieces here, we know that the gift of eternal life is assured because of that covenant that was cut in Genesis chapter 15 and because Jesus rose from the dead. Do you know that treaty that God had sealed with his blood? The assurance of that treaty will not be broken. God himself was willing to lay everything on the line. What's the obligation of us in that treaty? You know, Abraham agreed to that treaty too, you know. But he broke that treaty not too long after that. And I know that we in our lives constantly break that treaty. None of us sitting here today are perfect. We constantly break that treaty with the thoughts and the things that we do. But God is still willing to honour this treaty. He was willing to honour it with Abraham, even though he was not perfect. He's willing to honour that treaty with us, even though we're not perfect. So long as we, like the thief on the cross, are willing to turn toward Jesus each and every day. And it was here at that moment that Abraham saw what God was willing to do. And even though Abraham was not perfect, he was willing to walk with God regardless of the cost. Make no mistake, the treaty that God has signed with us has come at an enormous cost to the Father and to the Son. And we need to appreciate the cost so that our response can be, we give him our all as well, even though that it is flawed. And it's that honest intention to walk with God each day that is critical. And as we wash one another's feet, may we remember the cost of God himself walking through those pieces. The cost of what God was willing